In the village of Willowbrook, mornings began with the soft hum of sprinklers and the gentle rhythm of routine. Rows of trimmed hedges lined each sidewalk, and driveways gleamed beneath the glow of the early sun. The community seemed peaceful, almost timeless, an emblem of order and suburban pride. But beneath its manicured lawns and mailbox uniformity, a quiet storm was gathering, one that would soon unravel the very fabric of the neighborhood. Ethan Greene had always been a quiet man, the kind who blended into the rhythm of the cul-de-sac. He bought his modest three-bedroom home in 2016, drawn to Willowbrook's safety and structure. The HOA fees were steep, but he saw them as a small price for peace of mind. For years, he paid on time, attended meetings, and maintained his property exactly as the rules demanded. He was the model neighbor, or so everyone thought. By 2019, life began to shift. Ethan's job required frequent travel, long stretches away from home in distant cities. His house sat empty for weeks, sometimes months, gathering dust and silence. It was during one of those long trips that he stumbled upon the idea that would change everything. A coworker mentioned renting out their spare room on Airbnb, earning enough to cover mortgage payments. To Ethan, it sounded practical, harmless even. He wasn't starting a business, just letting people stay while he was gone. The HOA's covenant didn't mention short-term rentals, and the rules seemed clear enough. No external businesses. No storefronts. Nothing that disrupted the peace of the community. His quiet guests wouldn't disturb anyone. At least, that's what he believed. The first few stays went unnoticed. Guests came and went respectfully, leaving the place cleaner than they found it. The neighborhood remained calm. For Ethan, it felt like a perfect arrangement. Extra income, no trouble, no harm. But perfection, as Willowbrook would soon show him, was an illusion. One day, a neighbor noticed a car she didn't recognize parked in Ethan's driveway. A few days later, another unfamiliar vehicle appeared. The HOA president, Margaret Sloan, prided herself on vigilance. To her, every detail in Willowbrook mattered: the exact shade of mailbox paint, the acceptable height of garden gnomes, and most importantly, who belonged within their pristine borders. When she noticed the unfamiliar faces entering and leaving Ethan's property, her instincts sharpened. She began asking questions. Within weeks, whispers began to ripple through the neighborhood. Words like strangers, business, and rules echoed in hushed tones during morning dog walks. Margaret's curiosity turned to concern, and concern soon evolved into indignation. To her, Ethan's decision wasn't just a technical violation, it was an act of rebellion against the structure she worked so hard to preserve. The HOA's authority was the foundation of Willowbrook's identity. If one homeowner could sidestep the rules, what stopped the next? She sent a polite notice at first, a reminder about business activities being restricted. Ethan read it, confident that he wasn't breaking any laws or rules, and continued renting quietly. The guests were discreet, the neighborhood remained safe, and he saw no reason to stop. But the HOA saw defiance. What began as a small misunderstanding grew into a steady stream of emails, warnings, and notices. The HOA board began to meet more frequently, their conversations revolving around Ethan's home. Neighbors who had once waved now stared longer than usual. Some sided with Ethan, believing he had the right to use his property as he wished. Others whispered that he was undermining the neighborhood's integrity. The sense of unity that once defined Willowbrook began to fracture. Over the next year, the correspondence between Ethan and the HOA escalated. Every email became more formal, every letter more aggressive. Legal phrases appeared: cease and desist, covenant violation, non-compliance. What had started as a quiet side income now felt like a full-blown conflict. The HOA began recording alleged nuisances, citing increased traffic, supposed noise, and the transient nature of guests. None of it was substantiated, but in the world of HOA politics, perception often outweighed fact. By late 2020, Ethan's patience wore thin. He continued to pay dues but ignored the mounting threats. He hired a local attorney, who reassured him that there was no explicit clause banning short-term rentals. The HOA's no business rule, he argued, was too vague to apply. It should have been the end of it. But for Margaret Sloan and her board, it was just the beginning. They began imposing fines, small at first, then steadily larger. The HOA sent notices threatening to place liens on his property if he didn't comply. When Ethan pushed back, Margaret doubled down. For her, it wasn't about money, it was about control. Allowing him to win meant undermining the HOA's authority in the eyes of every homeowner. So, she gathered her board, consulted lawyers, and decided on the next step: litigation. In early 2021, a lawsuit was filed against Ethan Greene by the Willowbrook Homeowners Association. The complaint accused him of running an unauthorized business, violating the covenant, and creating a public nuisance. Ethan, blindsided but determined, prepared to fight back. He had evidence, correspondence, and the covenant itself. But lawsuits were slow, expensive, and draining. What neither side realized was that this conflict, fueled by pride, fear, and stubbornness, would spiral far beyond what either of them imagined. Months turned into years. Motions, hearings, discovery, each step drained Ethan emotionally and financially. Neighbors avoided eye contact, fearful of taking sides. The sense of community that once made Willowbrook desirable was now tainted with tension. Margaret's allies watched Ethan's yard for any sign of violation, reporting even the smallest details. The HOA's lawyer, funded by collective dues, pressed the case relentlessly. Ethan's lawyer warned him that the costs could climb into six figures if he lost. Still, Ethan stood firm. He was not a troublemaker, he told himself. He was a homeowner defending his rights. He had done everything by the book, or at least as much of it as anyone could understand. Yet, as 2023 approached, the trial date finally loomed. And when it arrived, the verdict would shatter the illusion of fairness that Willowbrook once claimed to uphold. By the time the judge delivered his ruling in January 2024, the courtroom felt like a battlefield. The decision was swift and devastating. The court sided with the HOA, declaring Ethan in violation of the covenant and ordering him to pay their legal fees, a staggering $152,282 plus penalties. In a single moment, his years of stability collapsed into financial ruin. His savings evaporated, his credit was destroyed, and bankruptcy became inevitable. The HOA, triumphant, moved quickly to secure a foreclosure order on his home. Ethan's life, the very foundation he built, was slipping away. Yet even as he packed boxes and faced uncertainty, something inside him refused to surrender. Because beneath the defeat he felt the truth hadn't been heard. The HOA had twisted vague language into a weapon. And so, as the sun set on his final night in the house he once called home, he made a decision that would reignite the entire battle. He would appeal. Bankruptcy has a sound, not a loud crash, but a hollow silence. For Ethan Greene, it echoed through every empty room of his home, the space once filled with the comfort of certainty now replaced by the weight of defeat. Boxes lined the walls, labeled in fading marker, each one a quiet reminder of what he was losing. The judgment had broken him financially. The HOA's victory wasn't just about money, it was about power, and everyone in Willowbrook knew it. After the court's decision, the neighborhood returned to its false calm. Lawns were trimmed again, driveways swept, and newsletters once more celebrated community events. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. Ethan's fall became the HOA's warning to everyone else, a message wrapped in legal language and delivered through fear. No one questioned the board anymore. No one dared to challenge Margaret Sloan or the bylaws she guarded like scripture. The HOA had won, and their authority was absolute. Ethan, however, refused to disappear quietly. Bankruptcy stripped away his assets but not his determination. The injustice lingered in his mind, replaying in fragments. The judge's words, the smirk of the HOA's attorney, the way the neighbors avoided his gaze after the verdict. He had read every page of the covenant, studied every clause, and still couldn't find where he had gone wrong. The more he examined the rules, the clearer it became. The language was vague, deliberately open-ended. It wasn't clarity that governed Willowbrook, it was interpretation. And that interpretation was in the hands of people who believed themselves untouchable. In the months that followed, Ethan began to rebuild in quiet defiance. His lawyer filed an appeal, arguing that the HOA's case was built on ambiguity, not law. The process was slow, but for Ethan, it was purpose. He had little left to lose and everything to reclaim. The HOA, confident that the matter was settled, was unprepared for his persistence. They underestimated the man they had crushed. They believed the fight was over. It wasn't. As the appeal wound its way through the legal system, Ethan worked part-time, picking up freelance jobs to stay afloat. His days blurred together in a haze of paperwork and exhaustion. Yet every small step forward was a rebellion against the HOA, against the system, against the quiet conformity of Willowbrook. He no longer waved to his neighbors. He no longer cared about appearances. He had become an outsider in his own community, but he found power in that solitude. Meanwhile, the HOA board continued its regular meetings, still obsessed with maintaining order. Margaret Sloane's satisfaction from the court victory began to fade as whispers reached her, rumors of Ethan's appeal, of his refusal to leave quietly. The thought unsettled her. She had built her reputation on control, on the illusion that the HOA's authority was unshakable. An appeal threatened that illusion. So, she doubled down. New rules were drafted. Letters circulated warning homeowners about continuing compliance. The board prepared for another battle before the first one had even ended. By late 2024, the appeal reached the state appellate court. It was no longer just about Ethan Greene or Airbnb rentals. It was about the limits of HOA power. Legal observers began to take interest. Local media picked up fragments of the story, framing it as a modern David and Goliath struggle between a homeowner and an all-powerful association. Willowbrook, once known for its tranquility, became a symbol of something darker, the hidden cost of control. As 2025 approached, Ethan's life was still uncertain. But in his persistence, he found clarity. He wasn't fighting for money anymore, he was fighting for fairness. He believed the HOA had twisted its own covenant beyond recognition. He believed that one victory in court could restore balance not just for him, but for countless homeowners who lived under similar systems. The odds were against him, but then again, they always had been. And somewhere in the quiet streets of Willowbrook, beneath the trimmed hedges and painted shutters, people began to wonder, what if Ethan was right? The question lingered like a whisper, carried on the evening breeze. Willowbrook looked unchanged from the outside, serene, perfect, ordinary. But change often begins quietly, in places people don't notice. The HOA board still met in the clubhouse every first Monday of the month, surrounded by framed photographs of smiling residents. Yet, the smiles felt different now. A divide was forming. Some neighbors began to see Ethan as a cautionary tale, not of rebellion, but of injustice. They spoke in low voices about the excessive legal fees, the harsh penalties, the bankruptcy. For the first time, people questioned whether the HOA had gone too far. Margaret noticed the shift. She could feel the tension in the room during board meetings, could hear the hesitation in her fellow members' voices. Control, once absolute, was beginning to slip. Outside those meetings, the story spread further. The local paper ran an article about a homeowner's fight for fairness, leaving out names but describing a familiar suburban community. Readers recognized the setting instantly. The piece mentioned a six-figure judgment, a foreclosure attempt, and an appeal that could change state law. Suddenly, Willowbrook was no longer just a neighborhood, it was a headline. Ethan read that article alone in his rented apartment. For the first time in years, he felt something resembling hope. The narrative was shifting. He was no longer the rule breaker, he was the underdog. And public sympathy was a powerful thing. The appeal had become more than a legal motion. It was a symbol of resistance against arbitrary authority. Meanwhile, Margaret struggled to contain the fallout. Neighbors who once admired her dedication now avoided her. Some skipped HOA meetings entirely. Others began quietly reviewing their own covenants, wondering what unseen traps might lie within. Margaret's pride, the very force that drove her, began to work against her. The harder she tried to reassert control, the more the community pulled away. The HOA's lawyer, sensing public pressure, advised caution. The appeal hearing was approaching, and the outcome was uncertain. If the appellate judges sided with Ethan, it could set a precedent, weakening HOA power statewide. To Margaret, that was unthinkable. Her identity was tied to Willowbrook's order. Losing control of that order felt like losing herself. As the court date drew near, tension gripped the community. The manicured lawns and smiling facades couldn't hide it anymore. Even the mailboxes, once symbols of uniformity, became silent witnesses to a neighborhood divided. And on the morning of the appeal, as the sun rose over the still streets of Willowbrook, something in the air had changed. Because for the first time in 6 years, Ethan Greene wasn't alone in his fight. The appellate courtroom was smaller than the one where Ethan had first been defeated. But the weight of what was at stake felt far greater. 4 months, legal briefs had passed back and forth, filled with arguments about interpretation, intent, and fairness. The case had grown beyond a single community. Now it was a matter of principle. When the decision finally came in July 2025, it arrived without fanfare. There was no dramatic announcement, no cameras waiting outside the courthouse. Just a few lines in a written opinion, but those lines changed everything. The appellate judges, in a 2-to-1 ruling, overturned the trial court's decision. They declared that the HOA's covenant language was ambiguous, and that renting one's home could not automatically be considered a nuisance. In that moment, the balance of power shifted. The foreclosure order was void. The massive legal fees and penalties were erased. Ethan's bankruptcy case was reopened for adjustment. For the first time in years, the system had acknowledged that he had been wronged. It was a quiet victory, but in its quietness, it was monumental. Word spread quickly. The local paper ran another story: Homeowner wins appeal against HOA. Social media lit up with discussions about property rights and HOA overreach. Ethan became an unlikely figure of inspiration. Homeowners from other neighborhoods sent letters, emails, and messages of support. They shared their own stories: fines for paint shades, penalties for flower beds, warnings for mailbox decorations. Willowbrook's case had become a symbol of something larger, a pushback against the culture of control that had defined so many communities. Inside Willowbrook, reactions were mixed. Some neighbors celebrated quietly, relieved to see fairness restored. Others remained loyal to the HOA, convinced that the decision would bring chaos. But one person could not hide her outrage: Margaret Sloan. To her, the ruling was an insult, a dismantling of everything she had built. In her eyes, it wasn't justice, it was rebellion legitimized by the court. And she vowed it wouldn't stand. Within weeks, the HOA filed a petition to the state Supreme Court, hoping to overturn the appellate ruling. They framed it as a matter of community preservation, insisting that the decision endangered the stability of neighborhoods everywhere. But beneath the legal phrasing was something more personal: Margaret's unwillingness to lose. The battle, it seemed, wasn't over. And as Willowbrook basked in the strange calm that follows upheaval, everyone knew that another storm was forming just beyond the horizon. Victory changes people, but so does obsession. For Ethan, the appellate win brought relief, but not peace. He had his name cleared, his home protected, but the scars of 6 years of conflict ran deep. He no longer trusted institutions or neighbors. The place that once represented safety now reminded him of everything he had endured. Willowbrook tried to move on, but it couldn't. The appellate ruling became the talk of every corner: in driveways, at mailboxes, during evening walks. Homeowners questioned past fines and demanded explanations. Margaret's authority weakened by the week. The HOA board fractured internally. Some members pushed for reconciliation, for revising the covenant to prevent future chaos. Others stood by Margaret, fearful that giving in would destroy the association entirely. Margaret, unwilling to admit defeat, focused all her energy on the Supreme Court appeal. She framed it as her final stand, the last chance to restore order. Her obsession consumed her. She spent nights drafting statements, writing updates, and meeting with attorneys. But beneath her polished exterior, cracks showed. She had become the very thing she once warned against: a source of unrest within her own community. Ethan, meanwhile, began to regain fragments of his old life. He returned to his home, not as a tenant of fear, but as its rightful owner. The lawn was overgrown, the paint faded, but to him, it was beautiful. It was his again. The victory felt personal, yet incomplete. He knew the HOA wouldn't stop. The pending Supreme Court petition hung over him like a shadow. By autumn 2025, Willowbrook no longer resembled the pristine neighborhood it once was. Petty disputes erupted between neighbors. Some refused to pay dues in protest. Others filed complaints about everything from noise to garden size. The HOA's credibility was collapsing from within. The structure that had once held the community together was now the very thing tearing it apart. As the year drew to a close, one truth became undeniable. Even if the HOA somehow won in the state Supreme Court, they had already lost the one thing that mattered most: trust. The final phase of the Willowbrook conflict unfolded quietly, far from the manicured lawns and painted fences that had started it all. The state Supreme Court agreed to review the case, not because of its drama, but because of its implications. The outcome could redefine how HOAs operated statewide. Months passed as the court deliberated. Legal experts debated the balance between individual rights and collective governance. But in Willowbrook, people had already made up their minds. The homeowners no longer saw Ethan as the villain. They saw him as a symbol of resistance. Margaret, isolated and exhausted, had lost the support of even her closest allies. Meetings that once filled the clubhouse now ended in silence. The once invincible HOA was crumbling. When the Supreme Court's decision finally arrived, it was simple and decisive. They declined to overturn the appellate ruling. The decision stood. Ethan's right to rent his home, and by extension, the limits of HOA authority, were affirmed. What began as a neighborhood squabble had transformed into a landmark ruling. Willowbrook's covenant, once a tool of control, was now a case study in restraint. Ethan stood outside his home that evening, watching the sun sink behind the oaks. The fight was over. Not because he had destroyed the HOA, but because he had endured it. The system had tried to crush him, and he had outlasted it. The house, once a source of anxiety, now felt like peace again. In the weeks that followed, Margaret quietly resigned from the board. No announcement, no farewell, just an empty chair at the next meeting. The HOA continued, smaller and quieter, its authority tempered by humility. Willowbrook slowly returned to calm, but the echoes of the conflict lingered in every corner, a reminder that control, once abused, can never fully return. And somewhere, behind one of those quiet doors, a man who had once been defeated now slept soundly, knowing that sometimes, even in the most ordinary places, standing your ground can change everything.